Okay, so we're going to look at social learning theory. Start off with, I'm just going to do social learning theory in general, and then towards the end I'll tell you how to apply it to gender, just as a revision. So keywords, I've highlighted some keywords here. Bandura is the researcher, very famous, make sure you can quote him. So what are the keywords? We need to say that we observe role models. We're actually learning just from watching them, just from that observation. And usually we'll copy them. Not always, but we will often copy them. We also learn vicariously from watching the consequences of their behaviours. And we'll talk about that in a bit more depth in a moment. So let's just have a look at Bandura's research. Bandura, as you know, got boys and girls to watch an adult kicking and punching and hitting, etc., a boba doll. And he had various different versions, so there are lots of different versions of Bandura, but one of the originals was that he then got the children to watch the adult being either rewarded or punished for their behaviour. And then he put the children in a room with all the equipment and watched to see what would happen. Okay, and in one of the versions, what he found was that those children who'd seen the adult punished were less likely to spontaneously copy. It didn't mean that none of them didn't copy. They all, they would copy, but they were less likely to spontaneously copy the adult. The thing was, and this is really significant here, when he asked all the children to copy what they'd seen, they could all copy the behaviour. Right, that's really significant because that's not what the behaviourist would say. So they could all copy the behaviours. Sorry, they could all copy the behaviour. The behaviourist would say that they had to be reinforced in order to learn. That the Bandura was showing that actually you don't need to be reinforced in order to learn. You might need reinforcement to copy, okay, to imitate it, but that's a very different thing. So you may have learned the behaviour, you just choose whether you're going to copy it or not. Okay, so, and the other key thing here is this, as we've said, the vicarious learning. This is by watching the consequences of others' behaviours. So whether a child copies or not depends on the consequence of what they've seen. So if the child has seen somebody punished for what they've been doing, then the child is more likely not to copy that behaviour. If they see somebody reinforced, they're more likely to copy it. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about these mediating cognitive factors. These are factors that come between the stimulus and the response. And we know that already from the cognitive model, but with SLT we're talking about the stimulus being the model's behaviour and the response being whether somebody actually copies it or not. SLT, they believe in these mediating cognitive factors. They say that we have to work out, we have all sorts of processes going on as to whether we are going to be motivated to copy that behaviour, whether we're going to bother or not. Okay, so differences between SLT and behaviourist, in case you need them. First of all, Bandura says that for learning to take place, the child just needs to observe it. The behaviourist would say the child needs to be reinforced in order to learn it. SLT, the child to repeat the behaviour, you need some sort of cognitive mediating factors that go on between the stimulus and the response. Okay, the behaviourists on the other hand believe that you need reinforcement just to learn it. So I've got there who's correct. Well, they're both correct depending on what we're looking at. Here, what sort of mediating factors that we need to quote? Attention. If you don't pay attention, you're not going to remember it. Retention or memory. Again, you need to be able to recall it in order to reproduce it. Can you actually reproduce it? Have you got the motor skills to do that? And finally, the motivation to copy. Is there some reason why you would want to copy that behaviour or not? So, who are we likely to copy? There are lots of bits and bobs of information there, but you can quote things like live, symbolic, positional, personal. Okay, so we've got some examples there. Try to also remember some of these factors. So warm, nurturant, in other words, people like parents, hopefully for most people. If you're more similar to the model, similarity, maybe your race, your gender, your age, your sex, all those things, your background, whatever, then you're more likely to copy. We are also more likely to copy those with higher status, so obviously it follows people in the media perhaps. We are also more likely to copy behavior that we see rewarded or reinforced, and little things like those with low self-esteem are more likely to do the copying. So that is the SLT. Just basically, we've got key assumptions. Let me come back to the gender one, but key assumptions, we're going to say that they believe that a lot of human behavior is learned just from observing role models. They believe that reinforcement can be indirect, in other words, vicarious. They also believe that mental or cognitive processes are very necessary in this learning, so something comes between the stimulus and response. Those are their key assumptions. What do we want to say about the strengths and weaknesses? And we'll come back to the gender. You've made some notes on this already, but good thing is it does take into account mediating factors that come between stimulus and response, and that's good because that it suggests that we have some sort of what we call personal agency, some sort of free will. We're not just merely responding, which the behaviourists are criticised for believing because it's quite dehumanising. It treats us a bit like puppets. Another plus point, make sure you develop the point. This little bit I've got on screen is not enough. Make sure you explain why. So another plus, uses both experiments and non-experiments, so things like observational techniques as well as experiments. That's great because, as you know already with your research methods, each different method has its strengths and weaknesses. And if you use more than one method, you're balancing out the weaknesses with strengths from something else. Obviously, observational learning, imitative observational learning, SLT, those are other names for it, observational or imitative learning. They can explain many behaviours. We know that happens for a fact. You just need to watch children around you. You see that it in action. However, the trouble is it doesn't really excuse me, fully explain why something can be reinforcing for one person but not for another. Excuse me. So that's a bit of a problem. Also can't account for all behaviour. So the example you got in your book is, you know, what if somebody turns to criminal behaviour and yet they haven't got a role model that they would look up to who does that sort of behaviour? How can that be explained? Okay, let's have a look at it in terms of gender. Social learning theory believes that we are socialised into specific gender behaviours during childhood. We're going to look at this in a bit more depth now. They believe that children observe parents behaving differently and therefore they're going to imitate that behaviour. If they're then reinforced for it, they are obviously going to carry on, they're going to imitate it more. Okay, and of course SLT, unlike other approaches, will say that we learn from others as well. We're going to learn from all sorts of other role models. We learn from birth, we learn from other role models, even cartoons, we learn from books, we learn from TV, etc. So we'll look specifically now at gender. Okay, with gender in particular, just make sure that you've also got some definitions. So if you remember, we've got imitation. We said it's consciously copying the behaviour of a role model. Identification, it's internalizing, taking in the behaviours, values, beliefs of a role model. Okay, make sure you can give examples. You've also got here modelling, all right, that's demonstrating behaviour that others may copy. All right, that's modelling. And if we just have a look, we're now going to apply this to gender. Okay, so we've said whose research is it based on, Bandura, as you know, and we've got various different slides here which we've just been through. So which studies can we bring in? Now you've actually got various things that we could refer to. Smith and Lloyd is in your textbooks, page 63, a very famous study. I think there are others that make it just easier for you to understand really how SLT is applied to gender. And the one that I would say is the best one, probably the one for you to go for first, is the Margaret Mead study. So Margaret Mead, if you remember, went to Papua New Guinea, and she studied 3 tribes, and she found very different gender behaviours in those 3 tribes. Okay, remember what we've said about SLT. It's about observing role models and then copying them. Okay, and there are mediation factors that come between. So here, this is a good example in her 3 tribes. these children would have, whichever tribe they're in, they would have observed their parents and all the other adults around them and other children around them all behaving in certain ways. So if it was a tribe where both sexes were very caring and nurturing, then that would be what they would copy, and they'd be reinforced for that. Okay, so just ensure that you have one of the tribes that you can outline, particularly a tribe that is seen as a little bit different to our Western sort of culture. Okay, so Margaret Mead would be a good example. Obviously with Margaret Mead, you are aware of problems. Make sure that you can comment on one of those problems as well, so you could bring it in. You could say evidence for SLT comes from Margaret Mead, and we outline a little bit about that, but then we say, however, Mead's work has been criticised. For example, she was a singular observer, and therefore there isn't any inter-rater reliability. Her reports, her observations could have been very biased because she had a point to prove. She was a feminist, and she did want to prove that actually males were able to look after children as well as females. So we could bring in one problem there. We also could bring in other research. You have already, we've got other things up here that we could refer to from your textbook. Okay, we've got the Faget study, for example, McGee, but let's stick with the Faget one that you did some notes on. Remember, Faget study is that observation. 2 researchers observing 24 families in their homes, and they were observed, if you remember, on 5 separate 1-hour periods. Okay, and what they found was that parents reacted more favourably to the child if they were engaged in gender-appropriate behaviour, and slightly more negatively if they were in gender-inappropriate behaviour. So, for example, parents gave girls more negative responses when they were engaged in very active behaviour. So what we're seeing here is that children will pick up on that. Children will see that girls behaving in passive ways and boys behaving in active ways, and therefore those girls and boys being reinforced for those behaviours. Remember, reinforcement doesn't cause the learning. With SLT, reinforcement is just saying it might encourage the children to replicate it, to imitate it. So be careful of that. Right? And again, we've got a bit of a problem with that research. We are basing our SLT research on research like that. Our SLT theory on research like that. But the trouble is with that one, the parents were very aware that they were being observed, and it may be that they felt that they were expected to make those comments, but in reality they perhaps wouldn't have made those comments. They may have behaved differently. There may be demand characteristics. So there are different things you could say. If you remember, we also had the Furnham study, the content analysis on the TV ads, all right, in about 1981. Furnham actually was 2000, Manston and McCulloch, very similar one, 1981. And what they found was that there were these stereotypes, and adverts were being used. Women were seen in the home, women were seen in nurturing roles. In adverts, they were advertising medicinal products, things like that. And again, children will pick up on things like that, and they'll think that is the expectation for them. So there are other pieces of research you could quote, that you could look up. All right, but those 3 would be good examples because we've got them for other areas of our course. Problems with social learning theory. What are you going to say? What are the problems with it? So problems in terms of gender. All right, we've got the general SLT problems, strengths and weaknesses, but in terms of gender, we would want to probably bring in alternatives. So we could say SLT believes, we learn through observation and imitation, etc. However, the biological approach has a very strong argument to say that it is due to our chromosomes, which then trigger off appropriate hormones. And bring in, very briefly, for example, the money study showed that the child there they tried to change into being a girl was very unhappy, and even though they had raised him socially as a girl and reinforced him for feminine behaviours, it didn't work. Okay, so bring something like that in, or the beach study, or W.C. Young with the monkeys. So some little bit of research there. Van Goosen, something to support a biological approach. You have also, you could say, even another alternative explanation come from the cognitive idea. So Kohlberg, for example, believed that we learn our gender in stages with identity, stability, constancy. And bring in a little point there. And they would say that, again, they would agree on the role models, but they think it's done, instead of a very gradual process, they think it's done in stages. So find something that's different specifically. Psychodynamic, of course, would totally disagree with SLT. Why? Because psychodynamics says we only learn our gender at the phallic stage, so roughly 3 to 6. And the other thing, of course, is they will say that we only learn from our same-sex parent. So we're going to take on the gender through the Oedipus or electric complex. We're going to identify with our same-sex parent and just internalize their gender behaviors. Okay, so watch out for that. They do quite like the comparison of psychodynamic with SLT on gender. So we've got various things there. Problems with research as well. You know, what samples are we using? Margaret Mead's research, for example, the Manstead and McCulloch. You know, there may be some historical validity there. Adverts may have changed. The Faget study, the parents knew that they were being observed. So it's worth you putting in problems as you go along with those studies. The other thing is, of course, what about all these children who show gender inappropriate behaviour, supposedly inappropriate behaviour, right? If they are being reinforced for typical gender behaviour, why are there so many who are behaving, you know, in the opposite way? For example, tomboys, etc. So that's worth putting in as well. And you know, there is a comment. You've got last one is about gender stereotypes. Last point, I think it's page 67 of your textbooks. So by now, actually, you will have had enough. You don't really need this one, but if you want this point, stereotypes, you know, it doesn't truly explain where the stereotypes originate from. Okay, and you know, the biologist would say that that was a biological reason. It's a biological cause. So it's in our evolution, really, in our evolutionary history, that females have been more nurturing, etc. SLT can't explain it in the same way, so there's a problem with that. Okay, and that would finish you off in terms of your gender explanations.